This question would be directed to Dr. Arevalo.
Arevalo, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
You mentioned the fears of the Founding Fathers concerning Toryism seeping into the education system and getting to the children and changing the values, essentially. And so I'm wondering what safeguards, if any, there are today in the Department of Education in place to prevent the teaching of disdain for the American way, which is what I feel I'm up against with my 9th grade and 10th grade students who refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance and even turn their back on the flag. And this is happening like on a regular basis with me every morning, where I have to call out students who just have disdain, and I'm not sure if it's coming. It likely starts in the home, I realize that, but it probably also is coming from certain teachers who have very different political ideologies. And I've heard it among the faculty at my particular school, so I'm just wondering what safeguards, if any, are in place for that kind of thing happening.
Sure, yeah, thank you for your question. This is a topic we talk about a lot at the Florida Department of Education. I mean, we live in a state that's blessed with a robust concern about patriotic education. But, you know, it's also a state that, as you alluded to in your question, recognizes that the parents are the first educators. And so whatever a school does, whatever policies are in place in the state, will always be, you know, play second fiddle to whatever's taught in the home. So really, I mean, what we need is a transformation of our culture, and the schools can play a role in that, but they're not going to be the whole answer. But when you ask what policies are in place, so that, you know, we're working incrementally here, but there has been a large push for a couple of things that I talked about, you know, pushing a more patriotic education, pushing for the founders to be recognized in the classroom. This is a concern of the legislature. There is a bill that's floating around right now. We're currently in session. There's a bill floating around right now that's bringing back oaths to the classrooms, oath of loyalty to the Constitution for professors, teachers in K-12. I'm not sure if it's going to get through, but it is proposed there. It is a concern that's out there. There's another one that I think has been passed, that the portraits of Washington and Lincoln should be in each classroom, or each classroom that teaches history. So, you know, again, these are works on the margin. I think that with the occasion of the semi-quincentennial, there's also a lot of programs like this one. I mean, this is being funded by the U.S. Department of Education, that with the intention of promoting those ideals in the classroom, starting up programs like this one that will be able to give you all the ideals, the tools to go back to your classrooms and really give your students a more robust idea of what a real patriotic education looks like, or real patriotic disposition. So, you know, and these are works on the margins. There is also a task that comes to us regularly of reviewing things that are taught in the classroom. You know, making sure that the textbooks that we're giving our students, the assignments that we're giving them, are not antithetical to that principle. So, yeah, my area is the colleges, but I know in K-12 they have a very robust system of reviewing in-class material. So, I mean, I could go on about this, and I'm happy to answer particular questions too. But like I said, it is a concern for the state, and in other states as well. I don't want to just speak about Florida. I know other states like Texas and North Carolina also have robust processes like these. But again, what we really need is changes in the home, changes in the family, changes in the culture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My apologies if I pronounce your name wrong, but Dr. Kirwan, I was wondering more when you were talking about the shift from like classical education to the more progressive education, and you specifically, I believe, mentioned like 1890 and the 20th century. What precisely, I know that's probably a very large question to ask, what precisely do you think caused that shift in more specific values?
There was a number of things that converged in the late 1800s. There was the beginning of behavioral psychology, which comes from a researcher in Germany. And his thought came here, and behavioral psychology was very much treating you as an organism, but it was this idea that we're going to measure everything. And you can really get and so it was very much kind of a neo-Darwinian idea of behavior modification, that if we could treat human beings like animals, and so if we develop the right stimuli, then we can get the right responses. This comes into the educational movement in a big way in 1903. And so this is the idea that we're going to measure everything, and we're going to, and so they actually had, these were the first generation of social science studies. So this is really important, where they start having these quote unquote university research studies that debunk traditional education. Now all of these were disproved, but they had these studies that showed that Latin was useless. Besides, Latin had no benefit outside of learning Latin if you had to teach the classics or something. Right? So this was all debunked, but they were hugely influential. And this was the idea that we're going to measure everything. And then there was, of course, remember, this is the age of Rockefeller and Carnegie. So you've got suddenly massive amounts of money pouring in. And they have a very vested interest in resuscitating their names because they're reviled in American culture. So they want to do philanthropy. The progressive educators got their ear. And they also are interested in job training. So this is another important current. It's called the social efficiency movement, where they basically want to shape schools to be like factories. We're going to get bells. We're going to we're going to assess everything. So they basically made common cause with a behavioral psychologist. The Dewey crowd comes up with this notion of a pragmatism that is not interested in reality. It's a pragmatism that's interested in problem solving and efficiency for the sake of progress. So everything, Hegel has come in. So now everything is future oriented towards an inevitable progress. And Orthodox Christianity has completely fallen out of favor. There was not a single major progressive educator. Every single one of them was raised in a devout Protestant home. And there wasn't a single one who had their faith by age 25 after university studies. So basically what happens is, but they've still got the Christian ethos. So heaven, the ultimate, the eschatology of, human beings on their path to heaven. Now that becomes very much this world oriented. So they were explicit about this. They said schools are going to be the new churches. Right? The old churches are based in superstition. So you've got the rise of social science, you've got the rise of pragmatism. The pragmatists reframe democracy as from a concrete social contract to a vague experience of progress. Right? This is John Dewey, Democracy and Education, 1915. Right? So you've basically got, there's probably half a dozen currents that all converge for this kind of perfect storm. And the liberal educators, they weren't ready for any of it. And so what's really interesting is, I've done a lot of study on this recently, is like, how did they do it? Was it just like Dewey or throwing some books out there? No, it was actually, they outworked us. It was a really kind of fringe grassroots movement, and they organized and they wrote pamphlets. And there was whole networks of progressive era women who were pushing this, and they would organize and go pull on Dewey's ear and go get Rockefeller money, and they've got the building for Teachers College. They organized the Progressive Ed Association, and so there was this whole grassroots movement where they were constantly pushing this thing forward. It was like, for all their bad ideas, it was like they did what Americans do really well, which is we organize really well and take over institutions really well. And that's basically what happened.
If I could add to that a little bit. There were some predecessors to the progressives that were also influential. Two of them that come to mind are Horace Mann and Henry Barnard. These were educators in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, who they had some ideas that were rejections of the ideals of the educational ideals of the founding, but their primary contribution was pointing to Europe, specifically to Germany, German ideas. And adopting some of those German ideals in the States. And probably the most influential ideal that they adopted, they started the whole common school movement, which made it possible to have a more uniform education. But their most influential idea was probably the establishment of what they called normal schools, these teacher colleges, that then the progressives used to diffuse ideals that they were pushing forward, and that's really allowed this movement to go from a little fringe particle to something that spreads out throughout the whole country very quickly.
Thank you, panelists, for your excellent presentations. My question is for Dr. Benitez, though I'd be happy to hear from any of you. We want carpenters and plumbers and electricians to be liberally educated, but society has told them that they don't need to be. They need to learn the technical skills of their job. How, without insulting them and saying, well, human life is hard and you don't know what you're doing, you need this. How do we persuade, or how does a teacher persuade a student who maybe wants to go into the trades, which is a noble endeavor? How do we convince them, persuade them to come along and learn the things that are necessary to live a human life well?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. In an ideal situation, I think that they would receive the liberal arts education that we would hope they would receive, get in a K-12 setting. And then if they choose to then go on to a trade or something like that, they've already received this robust education. And so I think a lot of it is through educational reform. I think a lot of it is through projects like this one that cause teachers to think about kind of where we've landed in education today. To have to think through that and kind of trace our steps a little bit, see where we've come from, how it's different now. And so I think a lot of that has to begin in the early years. But one of the things that I think makes our argument difficult is how expensive education is, especially higher education. And so I think the more we can find ways of being able to pass along this education in K-12, but also how do we find ways of making higher education more affordable for those who choose to go that route, I think that's important. I also think there's an argument to be made that increasingly, now with AI and how disruptive it's going to be of various workforce settings, I think that more and more we're going to have to make the case that education is about forming humans. The one thing that our talk shared, all three of them, is that education is virtue formation. And so I think the more that we recognize that, the more that we can then encourage people to see the importance of a true education and not just workforce training. And then one last point, and if any of the other panelists want to weigh in, I think part of it too is that for too long, academia has looked down on the trades. and has had a kind of arrogance in the way in which they deal with those who go into the trades, where I think recovering this idea that all human vocations are meaningful and purposeful because it is humans that are doing them is also an important part of this process. But certainly I think we, at K-12 and in the college settings, I think we need to be making the case, and we need to continually be making the case. And then I think I already said lastly, so whatever comes after that. I think programs, right? Perhaps a Master of Ed and Ed Leadership program at a local college where that robust emphasis in the liberal arts will be present, and then getting the right leaders in place to transform the schools. I don't know if you guys have anything to add.
You know what's interesting is I think that we've got, remember, I mean, our philosophical tradition is 2,500 years old, right? So we have this great conversation to build on. And so somebody made this remark in 1929. They said, look, nothing that the progressive educators are giving us we haven't thought of in terms of benefits. We haven't thought of before. So, for example, one of the great texts in the development of educational philosophy is this Parisian monk named Hugh of Saint Victor. And the French revolutionaries, inspired by Rousseau, knocked down the famous monastery of the Victorines. But anyway, he wrote this wonderful work in the early 12th century called the Didascalicon. And in the Didascalicon, he comes up with this kind of robust, conception of what true education is. Liberal education, we'd call it, or classical ed, right? And it's certainly even more robust than the founders from a Christian perspective, because it has the ultimate end is, well, not only moral or civic formation, but contemplation, right, of our highest end, which is, right, the beatitude. But anyway, what Hugh builds into it is manual labor. And in the very first chapter of the Didascalicon, he actually kind of defines education as fundamentally medicinal, right? Which is this beautiful understanding, awareness of, the limitations that we're born with through the infirmity of original sin, the effects of original sin from the Christian perspective. And so it's not this kind of fire and brimstone, notion of original sin, but it's education as medicinal. And then he has this kind of philosophical, the practical, the moral, but also the manual elements as a remedy, as instrumental, as primary, as really important in this process of recovery and reform and this kind of, this medicinal approach to restoring our human nature, wounded. And so I think Hugh has got some great things to say on manual labor that I think are totally applicable to modern day incorporating shop into the liberal arts or something. I can't see you over there, these lights, but whoever you are, right? Yeah.
Any other further questions?
Yeah.
I've seen really good public schools and really bad ones.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter got a college education in high school, graduated summa cum laude, now she's at Cambridge. She came from a failing school, she had to work her way up, and the only way she did it was by getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and working until 11, trying to get caught up, right? So most schools maybe they have honors program or AP program, and then most of the focus beyond that is what we call L25s, or the lower 25 percentiles. Along with that is a lot of behavior issues, not in all cases, but in many. With all of these students in the same classroom, my concern is, because there's so much focus on them, so many of the students, maybe even a bulk of them, get stuck in what I call the cesspool of mediocrity, because you're spending all your time and resources on the lower performing students, and you know that the students that are there, it's taking away from, in a large classroom, it's taking away from what they could be learning. They could be challenged at a higher level. Is there any better way that you can think of we can triage that? We like inclusion, have everybody in, but I'm really concerned about those people who are not really being challenged, and they're bright and they could be being challenged or not.
Yeah, I mean, our public education system is premised on the idea that every child should receive an education. And it's true that the first concern often is for those children who are struggling. And as you all said, often those who are talented get ignored, left behind because they're more capable, they can fend for themselves. I think that's a real injustice. We do need to have a more robust way of giving those children who for a myriad of reasons are more capable of studies, the chance to actually develop and grow and learn and take on what is truly challenging to them. I think, and I'll bring this back to the ideals of the founding. The founders were very conscious that people had different capacities, and they didn't prescribe the same education for everyone. The liberal education that they prescribed was for those who were, more capable, intending to be leading in society, or take on become lawyers and politicians and clergy. But because they had liberal education as an ideal, that elevated the whole rest of the educational project. And it's not like all of the students during the time of the founding were receiving an education in Greek and Latin. But because it was an ideal, it set the tone for the entire rest of the educational systems that they had. And so I think similarly, if we had a much more robust approach to those students who are the highest achievers, that has a leveling or an elevating effect for the entire rest of the school system, because we really are looking to set an ideal. And I mean, to bring this also back to the progressive era, one of the first things that started to bring in or usher in a progressive education was the elimination of Greek and Latin as prerequisites for college entrance. And so when universities started to drop that requirement, then all of the high schools said, well, why are we teaching this? And so they stopped offering it to all students. And so that led to a domino effect that really led to a kind of current state where we just think, oh, that's too hard for our students, and so we're not even going to try.
If I can add too, along those lines, well, not everybody received the same education. I think what ends up happening is we end up underestimating what students are capable of, and so then we don't demand it of them. There is this instance in which there was a British article that had come out and said that one of the British farmers had solved some kind of problem by reading Homer's Odyssey, to which Jefferson replied that it was actually an American farmer, because only our farmers are the ones that read the Odyssey. And so it is this idea that, yeah, even farmers were reading the Odyssey, right? And I think maybe it goes back to the question that was asked earlier, what about those that are going into the trade or manual labor? Well, even the farmers in the 1700s found great joy and great value in reading Homer's Odyssey.
Join us in falling in love with America again.